If you want to send me on to the next screen, Jennifer.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. And I'm back. I'll start piloting the slide.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chloe Swick, and I work with 3C Ren out of the County of Ventura. Before I hand things over to Jennifer and Grant, I have a few quick logistical slides to run through. Please make sure you're on mute for this training. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat or raise your hand, and we will ask you to unmute. We definitely encourage questions, so if you have any, don't be afraid to speak up. We also have AIA and AIA learning units and ICC continuing education units available for today's training. If you are hoping to receive those credits, please make sure you've registered for this event and are joining through the Zoom link that was sent to you when you registered. If a colleague of yours or a coworker shared a Zoom link with you, your attendance won't be recorded. We do use that registration form to count attendance. So if you are worried about that or want to make sure you're going to receive your units for today, please just send me an email. I'll pop my email in the chat shortly. You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. Before we get rolling, just a few words about who we are. We are the, excuse me, the Tri-County Regional Energy Network, aka 3C Ren. 3C Ren is funded by ratepayer dollars that we all pay into our utility bills through the public goods charge. And the benefit of being ratepayer funded is that there is no cost to those we serve. And as a regional energy network, we are able to return these dollars back to our local economy, which has historically missed out on some of these funds. 3C Ren currently offers 6 programs focused around 3 services. These include incentives, training, and technical support. Today's training is being provided by our Building Performance Training Program. And to learn more about our programs and register for upcoming trainings and events, you can visit our website, 3c-ren.org.
So sorry. Got a little.
Oh, no, yes, that was perfect. You can go ahead to the next one.
Okay.
Thank you. Through 2023, 3C Ren has had over 4,000 individuals attend trainings like the one we are presenting today. We've answered over 300 Title 24 and Cal Green questions, completed 1,374 energy-saving projects, and secured $155 million for investment in the Tri-County region. Our updated numbers for 2024 should be out soon, and I'm personally looking forward to seeing continued growth and support for our region. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jennifer and Grant for today's training.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Today, you do get learning units, AIA, if you need them, and ICC, if you need those. And I see, sorry, on the learning units, I got a typo here. So ICC units, it's 0.15 units. So don't get too excited if you're if you're in the code official. You get a fraction of those learning units. Sorry about that. Okay, the course today will be online for an hour and a half. And today we're really going to be focusing on kind of building scale batteries. We're going to have a course coming up later. I don't remember the date. Grant, you might chime in with that, but coming up, and we'll talk more about battery systems, grid interconnection, and how that affects us as architects, builders, community members on that larger scale, and get into some other details that we won't get into today. Today's going to give you kind of a sense of what is required at the building scale. Also, I want to let you know that I'm Jennifer Rennick. I'm a licensed architect, certified energy analyst. Grant Murphy, also certified energy analyst through Quebec, also does a lot of our commissioning and is a great code coach and part of the code coach service that 3C Ren offers. And Grant's going to monitor the chat. So please put any questions you have in the chat. And also the group, it's almost small enough that you could unmute and ask a question. if you have it, but put it in the chat first, and then we'll ask you to unmute if we need clarification about questions. And with that, I'm going to get going on the presentation. Kind of in general, when we're talking about battery storage, it's going to be related to solar PV for charging those batteries in this context of a building scale requirement in some aspects, or voluntary, just it's an opportunity for single family. The battery energy storage systems, they come in a lot of different sizes. So we've got the, kind of the private home size, and then there's standalone units that can be installed for multifamily and non-res, or kind of behind the meter. Sometimes people refer that to microgrids, but there's also very large power trains that can be put together for battery storage, for actual utility grid stabilization, and kind of front of the meter, they call it, for utility stabilization in whole communities. Today, we're just going to focus on that smaller scale, kind of the multifamily, single or multiple standalone units, and the private homes. And that's mostly because what architects are going to be kind of dealing with in terms of how they design their projects. I'm curious, how many on the call are architects? Feel free to put that in the chat and let us know, because I'll kind of cater some of these things to people's interests or kind of their discipline. In general, how we got started with the idea of batteries is we were introducing solar energy to our grid, and folks, meaning homeowners, wanted to design houses with the inexpensive solar panels available, relatively inexpensive at some point. So solar PV became more popular. It also then became a code requirement in the residential Title 24 Part 6 building code. And so this chart is showing, for example, just to kind of illustrate what was going on, is we could look at 1 year's worth of energy use by our appliances, hot water, space heating, everything that was going to use electricity. And we could predict, roughly an annual energy use based on how much energy per month would be used. And then we could overlay on that the solar output that a solar PV array associated with that house could produce. And not surprisingly, in the winter when the sun doesn't shine so much, the production of solar is maybe half of what that house would need, depending on the solar PV array size. And then in the summer months, we'd have a lot of solar production, and there wouldn't be very much home energy use if you were in the milder climate zones that we have in our Tri-County region, where we're not depending a lot on electricity for air conditioning. But even up in North County, that profile fits with what I have, even in climate zone 4. So what would happen is we'd essentially ask the grid, the big energy grid, to be a seasonal battery so that we could overall produce as much energy with that PV system as the house used in 1 year. And that logic was also applied to commercial buildings and buildings that were wanting to achieve zero net energy. That's okay. So that's kind of a seasonal battery effect. But then daily, every single day, California and individual homes have a energy use pattern, which this famously called duck curve illustrates where starting at 12 a.m., kind of at the bottom, you've got energy, a certain amount of energy use that every building, every household would use. And then if you follow the 2015 line, it's fairly flat. And that energy use doesn't change too much throughout the day. But then at night, in the evening, starting around 6 p.m., 5 p.m., that we start using more energy at night. And then it kind of tapers off as folks go to sleep, go to bed, and then it, kind of pops up the next day. And so what was happening is that every code cycle and every year that we started adding more and more solar to the grid, either distributed or, on a grid scale, the amount of solar energy we were producing countered the amount of energy needed. So the net energy use for that day was becoming less and less. And so as these years got mapped out of like what a typical day would look like, started to create the shape known as the duck curve. So as the energy production drops off and the household energy steeply ramps up, then the utility grid was having to do certain things to get that ramp up in energy after the sun goes down and we don't have solar. And so the solution to that is batteries, or some way to store the energy when the sun is shining on a daily basis, and then use that energy at night when it peaks up and it's needed. And that's kind of the basis of how and why we're starting to see so many batteries, and why batteries are becoming part of a code requirement for the non-residential and high-rise res right now. Still on single family, it's just optional. So the reasons for employing batteries, mostly for the single family, but all occupancies, is kind of load shifting. So we could use the batteries when the electric rates are the highest cost, because most of us are time of use. So 4 to 6 p.m., our electricity costs the most. That's when we could use, 4 to 9 p.m., that's when our electricity costs the most, and we could use the battery during that time, could save a little bit of money. A lot of folks want batteries because of resiliency, because of when the power goes out, high winds, maybe they have to shut down a certain part of the grid, or maybe someone accidentally, accidents happen. A car could run into a utility pole and that neighborhood gets shut down for a little while. So you've got your battery to keep going during grid outages. And then there's the utility desire to have grid stability in general. And we'll really talk a little bit more about that in our other course. And then the self-utilization, that's a credit where you in Title 24, where you can store the excess on-site solar energy for use later, and you can incorporate that battery into your calculations, and you can use it in a performance calculation for new construction. And the idea is that the battery gets used daily, depleted and then recharged, depleted, recharged. And I'll give you an example of what that looks like and some graphs based on my own experience with that. And then there's the code requirements, and we'll hit on this as well. For multifamily, 4 stories or greater, and a number of commercial occupancies, if PV system is required or triggered, then a corresponding battery size is also required for that system. Okay, Grant, anything you want to add to that before we go on to the next section?
Are you going to touch on the Sarah solar requirement that dictates the battery?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
No.
In the non-res. Yes. Non-res section. Okay, so kind of just give you an idea of what the residential single family batteries look like, kind of what that market looks like, and also that these batteries are really appropriate for a lot of the commercial scale projects that end up requiring batteries. The market for home batteries is getting larger every day. So the last time Andy or Grant and I did this class last year, I didn't show as many batteries on this picture, and there's new batteries that have come out, and I didn't have time to get tracked down, but Duracell, for example, that's a well-known like battery brand, and same with Energizer. They're both coming out with their home battery systems as well. So the market's growing really quickly, and this just gives you a visual of what some of the most popular battery systems look like right now. To learn kind of more about that market and what's predicted, what's going on, EnergySage.com is a really good resource where they do a lot of research on solar and storage marketplace. And so from their latest reporting, it kind of shows the graph on the left, which batteries have the highest percent of the market right now. So Enphase and Tesla are by far the most popular. And then, Franklin, SolarEdge, Panasonic, et cetera, it goes from there. And then the tiny sliver on that in the last quarter here of 24 that this report is from, there's at least 22 other brands that occupy the kind of the last bit of space for the batteries, but there's many to choose from. And right now, kind of the least expensive or for our current situation is the Tesla battery coming in at around 1,000 kilowatts per hour, so kWh. So for every kWh of battery capacity is shown, you can count on at least $1,000, and then kind of the median price is around 1,133. So just give you an idea of that. Now, the last time I did this class last year, there were some brands that were costing 2, 3, 4 more than that times the median or times the lowest rate unit. And now the prices are starting to come down more in alignment with each other. So Generac, for example, is, not quite twice as much as the Tesla. And then just to kind of, batteries go with PV for the situation that we're talking about on the building scale. Just to kind of hand in hand is the cost of PVs have also come down. So now in California, we're looking at a median price of like just over $2 per kilowatt hour. And you can see from the chart on the left that every quarter starting from 2014, and now we're looking at 2024, for the past 10 years, the price of the solar has almost steadily decreased, with the exception of the little blips we were having where prices increased a little bit during the pandemic with supply chain issues. But now the prices have come back down again. In terms of battery chemistry, I want to address this because most of the batteries, even a year ago, were the lithium, just called lithium ion batteries. And a lot of batteries will still be called lithium ion batteries, even if they have a different chemistry, because they have lithium in them. But the one that was responsible for potential thermal runaway, but still at a very high power density, like the Tesla, the first one, and the Tesla Powerwall 2, and some of the Tesla's big battery banks, those were using lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt. Those that system is really, that chemistry is being phased out. And so now most all of the brands of batteries have gone to lithium, ferro, or iron phosphate. And you'll see them as listed as LFP. And so that's a non-combustible chemistry. It also has a high power density and it's cobalt free. And lithium is actually quite easy to get a hold of, even though most of it we do import, but we have resources that we're developing in this country because we do have quite a bit of lithium in our own country. And then there's also a lithium LTO battery chemistry that's also cobalt free that you'll see some of the batteries use. So I think just now that the market, that even that battery chemistry market has shifted, I think it's good to be aware of it. So like your newest Powerwalls, the Powerwall 3, Tesla, and those other brands of batteries I showed you, most of them are going to be the LFP. So safer. Nonetheless, when we're looking at building scale batteries, we still need to follow our fire safety regulation on it, as well as our Title 24. So I'll hit on a couple of the fire code issues that apply to setting up your battery system. And kind of goes back to why single family residence, or could be a duplex or new ADU, would want a battery. And it's tied to the fact that for new construction, you're needing to include PV on that house per the code requirement. And a lot of homes, when they look at that, they're like, maybe I should add more PV because I know I'm going to have an electric vehicle, for example, or someone in the future might have that electric vehicle. So perhaps I should add more PV, strive to be closer to zero net energy, and have the battery storage for resiliency and energy independence, and kind of make a whole new system. And under the new electric pricing, kind of nicknamed NEM 3, the solar PV with battery storage in some cases can be more cost effective than a PV system alone. Not always, but it can, or it can be very close. So I have an example that I'm going to run through where the cost, the actual payback is just 1 year difference with and without the battery, but with the battery, overall, the homeowner over the course of the whole lifespan of the PV system would save more money with a battery system. And we'll also touch on how do you kind of figure out how much solar and battery storage would you need. Some of the general design considerations to keep in mind as you're starting to plan for your solar system and the PV system and you're designing projects is just keep in mind you can do indoor installations. I'll cover what some of the fire requirements on the next slide, but more and more folks are opting for outdoor installations. When you do the outdoor installations, you do want to, protect everything from damage, and you do want to protect it from temperature extremes. Although with the newer batteries, it's not as kind of critical with the batteries that contain the cobalts, but you want to keep in the shade if possible, not have it in freezing temperatures, protect it from adverse weather conditions because all the outdoor components will just wear out faster. And you need to maintain 3 feet distance from pathways of travels, doors, windows, etc. And of course, you got to follow the manufacturer's installation requirements. Specifically for fire safety, you can have multiple home battery units, but they need to be 3 feet apart or more. And if you do end up putting your batteries inside, because it was popular to design a wall in your garage for them to protect them, all those spaces have to have 5/8 inch type X gypsum board, continuous ceilings and walls. And, you would be the slab on grade in a garage example, or most commonly slab on grade. And you can combine these batteries larger, but the fire code does put a limit on how much capacity you could put within a space. So if you know you're going to put it inside a closet or storage space, for example, you can't exceed 40 kWh in battery size. And then each individual unit can't be more than 20 kWh. So good news, your battery systems, when you look at those home batteries, each one of those ones I pictured is far below 20, and you can gang them up, and they're packaged in a way that's going to meet the code. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Now, batteries on the residential are optional. You not code required to have a battery. You just have to be battery ready for new construction. And with battery ready, specifically, they're looking, your plans examiner should be looking on the plans for your new 225 amp main panel, okay? And then a sub panel for branch circuits that are going to have a minimum, you can do more, but a minimum of 4 branch circuits shall be in that sub panel and identified as having your refrigerator and a lighting circuit near the primary egress, a sleeping room receptacle outlet, and then a 4th one that's your choice. But that would be the minimum, and you could do the whole house actually if you want. And then you have to have space for what's called isolation equipment, sometimes called a transfer switch. Tesla calls it a gateway. It's basically the controller that really communicates with the battery and the sub panel and everything else to make the whole system work. And when you kind of put all the parts and pieces for a PV system, so it has to have its inverter, you got your battery, you got the controller, the transfer switch, then you've got your main panel, and you've got your kind of backup panel. Now, you're going to see some different names applied to these things, and this is just one example that we have of what that looks like, but some of the parts and pieces aren't going to necessarily be exactly laid out like this or its size. And I'm going to show you what it looks like on my own house, just to give you an idea of what kind of to plan for. So I had solar installed and got 2 batteries, and they gave me a new main electric panel. So that's that 225 amp panel. I got my sub panel, which in this case, we just did the whole house to it. It also is where we can do the disconnect and turn everything off. And then there's the isolation, or sometimes called transfer switch or gateway or controller. Okay, so that's kind of what it looks like with the lids off, just to give you an idea of what is kind of inside there. And then when everything's closed up, it looks like this. And that most of those controller gateways are approximately 16 inches, sometimes a little wider, by 26 inches tall. So they're not small. And then you can see from the scale just kind of how much space the other components take. And then each of those all have to go into the rest of the, all the wiring is then into a common box, and then that goes underneath my crawl space and then behind the wall, and then it's on the other side of the kind of the old fireplace, where I have a wall that's clear, free from the windows and doors and protected. This is where I have the batteries, and each of these batteries are, approximately 33 inches by 46 inches, and they're, easily 3 feet apart. And this is where you have your, like that home load center and disconnect and the inverters from the PV system. And those all are connected together and then communicate with that controller. And that I think gives you kind of an idea of how much space it takes. Now, if you only had one battery and you were just planning for that, you basically can cut all that in half, and it is possible to stack some of these things above each other. But when they're installing it, the way that things install on the wall now, you need some clearance above. They're probably not going to really want to stack these things on top. They'll probably want to do it side by side, like this example, just because of the practicalities of how they attach everything. Now, practically speaking, if you haven't lived with a battery, or you've got your clients who now have PV system coming in and it's code required, and if not, either way, if they go with a battery system or not, a lot of folks are unsure what their utility bill is going to look like. And so one of the things you have to maybe prep them for is that they will still get a utility bill, and all these systems are grid tied, and they will still be charged electricity costs from the company. And that's something that, in my case, I'll show you some slides of kind of the energy use and what I've done to play with. But for me, it's kind of fun to look at all these graphs and charts and figure out, can I go the whole day and be really self-sufficient and just use the solar and the battery in one day cycle and depend very little on the grid? And sometimes I can. And then what I've learned is that when I have, like, for example, a laundry day, and every teenager in my household, including myself, is doing laundry, yeah, there's no way. And so I know that during those periods, I'm going to be getting, charged grid rates. And especially if we're doing the laundry at the most expensive time of, the rates in the evening, I'll get charged for it. And so I will have a utility bill, plus I'll already be paying for the solar in either terms of a loan, or in this case, a PPA. So it's been kind of fun to play around with that. But the electric dryers, I could tell you, pull a significant load, and so does car charging. So, for example, you can look at, and this is kind of comes back to client expectations, I think. So when you're talking to your clients, hey, you might, or yourself, decide to do a battery, kind of that expectation is understanding how this whole system's going to operate. And so there's energy production that you're going to get from your PV system, and then there's an energy flow. And you can often ask yourself, okay, are you going to charge the car or charge your battery, right? And for battery grid tied systems to get credit under Title 24, that battery needs to take priority, because part of it is this grid stabilization. But for example, these were 2 days in a row, and one day was, and this is in the month of March, it was super sunny, really clear day. I knew I was going to be getting a lot of solar that day. And so I plugged my car in to get it charged up, and I could tell it to charge only when there's enough solar. And so then the controller, it figured it out. So it made sure the battery was getting charged like it needed to be charged. And then the rest of it could go into my car. And that day I only depended on the grid for 1%. Okay. And then the next day, or soon after that, within that week, it was super cloudy and foggy in the morning, and it's the same sort of thing. I could tell my car to charge on solar, but it knows, and it can look at how much solar production is happening at that time. And again, it gives the battery priority so that I can have the battery for that evening, because it's all part of that figuring out the duck curve and, day-to-day resiliency. And so the battery gets charged up pretty much the same each day, but no car charging that day. It didn't happen. And then the house used, not so much energy that day as well, because we knew it was cloudy, foggy, and I kind of played around with it. So these things that comes on once you get your system, you can play around with this because you'll have an app that'll allow you to look at your energy use and energy production. And I don't think I've shared this with folks on any of the classes yet. So if some of the other things might be a little review, but if you have any questions about this, feel free to ask. It's kind of fun to play with. And then what I find out is after a while, then it's not as interesting. And then I forget. And then I have a day where I'm like really dependent on the grid. But I can have days where it's like 1 or 2% on the grid, almost 100% self-contained. The kind of that same day where there wasn't quite enough, when the morning was foggy. So I looked at that same day on some other charts, and you can see that on the graph on the left, this gray color here is my household using the battery, and the energy use spikes every time like lights kick on or something changes, or the heating, the mini splits kick on. Those things will spike that energy use, but it's relatively consistent throughout kind of the day that the battery's discharging. And then in the morning, there was we had depleted that battery at that time throughout the night. It paces it out. And so there are some times where the battery gets to a certain level and it won't continue to discharge, because you can set the level on your battery to always keep a little reserve in case the power grid goes down. So that's set. And then when it reaches that, kind of that lower limit, instead of taking your battery to zero, it just automatically kicks in that you use grid energy. And so that morning, it's really spiked up around 7 in the morning because I started doing a bunch of chores and everything, and kicked on a whole bunch of stuff, including my dishwasher, and threw in a load of laundry. And then all that initial stuff happened. And then it, went back down. But then when the sun starts to come up, and then the solar production happens, and that's what this big hump is in the dark blue. And then you can, look at your charge and discharge, and then the graph on the battery kind of shows the same thing. And when it's flat, it just means it's not charging or discharging the battery. And then when the battery is being recharged from solar, then the yellow graph shows that. And it kind of mirrors these two things with each other. And I can nerd out about that as much as anyone wants. So, but I'll move to the next slide. Grant's like, okay, we probably heard enough about that. Okay, now a lot of you, though, for your battery resources, you might be wondering, yeah, okay, that's great and fine, but how do I figure out what size I need? And how do I understand if there's going to be a cost savings? And how do I, direct my clients to those resources to understand it? So luckily, there are some good industry websites that can help answer those questions. And there's a link to PG&E's solar calculator tool that includes some battery storage that's useful. And I'm going to run through that for you real quick. So this is the residential scale size, enphase.com for homeowners. has a resource there where you can click for the homeowners and then design my system. And it helps you figure out really what you need. And then it'll give you some estimates based on the questions that you answer. And basically kind of what size of a battery would you need based on your use and what you want to back up. So I think that tool was super useful and a good way to just kind of understand the proportions of what you need. And then you take that information. Now, I got to warn you, all the sites, they just talk about the battery. And so you think, oh, I've got enough room for this battery. But then don't forget all the other pictures I showed you and all the other parts and pieces that really go to the whole system. So you need more room, but this will get you started on the battery. And then Energy Sage, it's the same website that had the marketplace, so energysage.com. It has a tool that you can use to calculate how much solar and battery you need, and will give you information on your costs, your payback. That's a good tool. And it'll also set you up so that if you want folks to call you about the PV and battery system, you can engage in that, and you'll start to get calls from installers, distributors, etc. Also, some of the manufacturers you could go to, and this is just a couple that I went to. Every one of them, they want you to look at their batteries, so they're getting more and more user friendly. But I noticed that the LG site and the Goal Zero site were fairly straightforward to use, and the graphics were kind of easy to understand and start to figure out, hey, if you want to back up your microwave and your lights and your refrigerator, for example, and do some car charging, how much battery would you need combined with your solar? And same thing with, the Goal Zero for the Yeti. It says, okay, it'll start to help you understand that if you're going to run your microwave for 15 minutes, how much energy is that going to take? Same thing with your coffee maker, same thing with your refrigerator. In my case, rather than kind of picking and choosing all that, because I knew I was grid tied anyway, it was just like, we just did, okay, just do the whole house. Because I can choose myself not to turn on things, but I knew everything that I turned on, like I wanted to have energy to it, like, because I'm not completely off grid. So when I have to use my computer, I want it to turn on. So I wasn't trying to limit certain circuits. But for kind of that battery ready requirement, you only have to have the 4 circuits ready for the battery. PG&E has a good resource. You can use their solar calculator. So go to guide.pgne.com. I like this. I like this program a lot, their watt plan. You can choose, in my case, that you're going to make energy efficiencies on the building. For me, I just said no, so that I could get going on the program easily, but you can include those costs as it gives you this estimate. And then they're going to ask you questions about your energy use. And in my case, I did I entered some monthly electric use based on the profile of a house that we were working on. And we took the, Title 24, you can get what's called an Econ 1, and it gives you an estimated monthly use. You could plug that in and start to get an idea of what might be required for a system. And then you can kind of fine tune the battery storage and the PV plan and play around with size of solar and battery. And the solar, say, could be sized to a code required size. And you could use the property address if it's in PG&E territory, or you could still get an estimate from it by just choosing a property address in the territory so that it engages with the climate data and solar data. And you could take a look at those systems, fine tune some of the assumptions, like in this case, now looking at it based on those updated marketplace, I might change the installed solar unit price, for example. I might increase the storage system cost for the battery, for example. And I might have the utility rate increase more than 2% a year, but that's super conservative. We know it seems to be going up more than that. And then it's going to give you kind of, if you knew you wanted to install solar today, you could, take advantage of that. But otherwise, it's going to give you some results and kind of show you what your system solar without a battery would look like and solar with a battery, and map out your solar production and how much expected to use. And then it's going to give you some more charts where you can look at the predicted usage based on that utility bill and sort of show you that the solar with battery is going to give you less energy pulled from the utility grid. And the blue is the utility grid electricity. So the battery definitely, battery, like on my house example, it charges your battery when the sun is shining strong and reserves that so you can use it in the evenings or in all the times when the sun's not shining. And then depending on the size of battery and PV you put in there will adjust the graphs on how much grid interaction that you have with that. And then it'll give you this great output of solar only or solar and storage, give you an idea of that kind of estimated system cost. If there's incentives in your area, tries to include those. And when I say area, I mean incentives in California and Inflation Reduction Act incentives. And then it'll give you a break even. So like in this case, this particular example, the break even for solar only is 6 years, but you add the storage, so you don't break even for another year, but your overall net savings over 20 years is higher than it is solar only. And then if you're in new construction and your client opts for the battery, so you can get this advantage of having a battery system, but sometimes we're finding you need that battery because, like, there was an ADU, for example, I just took a look at yesterday with one of our HERS raters, and we were looking through the Title 24 and the whole project, and they had 2 batteries for that system, and they needed it because of the quantity of glazing and the lack of exterior continuous insulation, for example. And so they needed that battery to boost it. And the homeowner thought that's great because they had this beautiful little piece of property and the views were gorgeous. That's what they wanted. They had to do solar anyway because it's a new construction build. And so they're like, great, it's cost effective for me to do the battery in the long term, and I can still keep all my glass. Okay, good. That's kind of what they did. If, just kind of FYI, if you have a property in qualifying tier 2 or tier 3 fire zones, you might, that battery might be qualify for some additional rebates, but you'll need to go to PG&E website and really kind of track that through and follow through on it to see if you qualify. But I just want to give you a heads up because the battery for self-utilization, resiliency, I mean, our utility company wants that for people. Okay, we are now kind of at the non-residential and high-rise residential portion. And this portion, because battery is required, I'm going to go into some calculations and give you an example for that. But I want to know if there's any questions kind of on the single family and townhome residential scale project. And if there is, put it in the chat and Grant can let me know. Okay, for
So far.
non-resident. Yeah, and Grant, if you have any comments or any questions or anything too, just chime in. Okay, for high rise and non-res, for certain occupancies, PVs are required and there's a battery requirement. So occupancy types, restaurants, theaters, libraries, schools, warehouses, etc. They had a PV requirement. And under the 2025 code that's coming up in January, a lot of these occupancy types had an increased requirement for PVs and for PVs and batteries, sorry. And restaurants, for example, had a pretty dramatic increase. That's just one of the occupancy types I noticed that bumped up quite a bit. And then once that PV system is sized, you can size the battery after it. Now, when we're talking about some of the commercial projects, you might end up with a kind of standalone, larger battery looking container rather than the smaller wall mounted battery systems that we just saw for the single family. Not always, but sometimes you're going to end up with something more like this. And these things come as a pre-configured package battery energy storage system. Okay, so Fortress Power is one brand, and you can take a look at their website. I grabbed that graphic from them because it was a good graphic, but this is a brand we've been seeing in our area. And then this is another example, and this we haven't worked with these guys yet, but they're trying to get in our area, but they're based out of Hayward, California. And one of the projects they've had is Stanford University, their EV bus fleet. They've got PVs with battery storage, and you can learn more about them at their website, poshenergy.com. But I grabbed a couple of these graphics off their website because I thought it gave a good idea of what really is inside these cabinets. And they're basically set up with battery modules on one side, and then all the controllers and all the onboard electronics, the brains of the thing on the other side. And there are doors that open on both the front and the back. So you need clearances. You need about 5 feet clearance, both front and back on these. And the units like this size, about 6 feet wide, 7 feet tall. This particular size is about 3.5 feet deep. And then there are narrower ones because you don't need so many battery modules, for example. So you can take a couple of feet off of them and they're thinner standalone towers. But that's kind of the direction for some of the, larger commercial projects. Okay, I saw a chat thing go up. Anything, any?
Yeah, Ian just had a comment saying that it's important for us to distinguish between prescriptive or mandatory requirements. I think you're going to get into some of that now for non-res, and I was wondering if he had specific comments to the residential portion, or if he was thinking non-res as well.
Yeah, that's a good question because
non-res. Okay. Yeah, I think you're going to get into it.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting, right? Because, right, what Ian's saying is that your project isn't mandatorily required to have PVs and batteries. it's a prescriptive requirement, meaning if you follow the recipe card checklist to comply with your building with that recipe or that checklist, you got to do everything that's on the checklist. And then if you do that, this is the PV system size you're going to be required to have, and there's a battery that goes with it, and now you've met everything on the checklist. Under the performance method, the computer method, you're not required to have PVs or battery, but it's almost impossible to comply without it unless the project meets certain exemptions. And the battery sizing and the PV sizing can change under the performance method compared to the prescriptive. But the prescriptive method as a tool is a great way for your design team early on to start to get a handle on how much space do you need to set aside for the PV system and how much battery might be triggered, so you can, again, as an architect, design for the space that may be needed for that. And if you, or at least be able to reach out at that point to your electrical engineer and say, hey, based on these rough calcs we did, we are probably going to need some battery. Can you help us, map out how much space we're really going to need for the battery and where it should be located, et cetera. Make sure it's part of the site planning and the building planning. So in order to follow that, kind of get you a rough idea, the equation is fairly straightforward, and it's based on a climate zone factor from a table times the conditioned floor area. And that's going to give you a kW DC PV system size. And once you know that, you can look at that and then start to get an idea of what PV system could meet that requirement. And then you could start to get an idea of how much area it would take for that. Today, I'm just going to look at the battery calculation in terms of that, an example, but your PV calculation has to be done first because it informs how much battery size you need. And with the PV systems, there is some exceptions. Like if your system is less than 4 kW DC, you don't have to do it. There's a requirement, there's an exception for SARA, and I have a slide on SARA coming up. And SARA is your solar accessible roof area. So if it's less than 80 square feet or contiguous, you don't need it. 80 square feet is not very big. You can't get very many panels. Or if it's less than 3% of the conditioned floor area. So we do have that sometimes on multi-story buildings. And then what's left of the roof is just not a high enough percentage of the whole conditioned floor area to warrant PVs. So we have had some high-rise projects that have gotten out of the PV requirement because of these exceptions. But then a lot of our projects that either have enough roof area or are not very tall, they're not meeting these exceptions. And so PV and battery are being required. Under the 2025 update, they are making an differentiation between your low sloped roofs and your steep sloped roofs, meaning that your PV system size prescriptively is going to be either a SARA factor times 14 watts per square foot under the new code, or that conditioned floor area times area factor. So for example, on the right, if we've got a mixed use project, the climate zone 4, and this is an example taken from a project we worked on. The restaurant was 2,000 square feet. The retail space was 3,500 square feet. The office and the unleased space was 7,000 square feet. So I was just looking at that portion, the smaller building there, and it had a SARA of 4,500 square feet. And so I take each of those conditioned floor areas, multiply it times its climate factor, and divide it by 1,000 to get the answer. And it was 33 kilowatts for that project. Or we look at the 14 watts per Sarah, and it's divided by 1,000 there to turn it into kilowatts, and 63 kilowatts. So we go, it's the smaller of the two. So 33 kilowatts was all the PV system required for that building. This slide, it included it. So use it for the 2022 code. And it gives you those climate zone factors based on the climate zone. So 1, 3, 5, 16's all grouped together. And then 2, 4, 6 through 14's grouped together. And then climate zone 15. And then you've got your occupancy types on the left. And that those numbers inform kind of this part of the equation. So the 0.44, your 2.91, 3.13, those numbers are coming from this chart here with these 0.44, 3.13, and the 2.91, for example. For 2025 code, the equation's the same, but we've got a new set of PV factors. And this time the code update is really looking at each climate zone individually and starting to look at what makes sense for each of our 16 microclimates in California, and also what is going on with the actual supply of grid energy and the energy mix on the grid. So now we're looking at the building types, and it's teased out. We don't have them lumped together, and it's specific for each climate, but you follow the equation the same way, and you get slightly different PV system size array for the 2025 code compared to the 2022 code. But for example, if you're a restaurant, your PV, that number went up dramatically under the 2025 code. So just kind of FYI, if you're trying to figure out which code cycle to go in, and if PVs are a big factor. For that solar access roof area, just a reminder, it's any roof area that has 70% or more solar access. And it can be, you know, it's all of the roof space capable of supporting a PV system. And it can also include carports and parking areas. For battery storage, there's two equations, and they both are requiring your PV capacity size is put into this equation. And you do one equation that's the kilowatt hour, the same unit we were using to talk about cost, where you could look at a cost of like approximately $1,000 per kilowatt hour battery capacity. So same units there. It's dependent on your PV times a building factor. And then it is 0.5, like 1/2, you know, square, as in to the power of D to the power of 0.5. And that D is the trickiest part of this equation, because you actually have to have a battery to know what the discharge cycle efficiency of the battery is to plug into the equation. So it feels a little bit like a chicken and an egg. But you could use like a 0.8 and even up to a 0.95, although, you know, 0.8 is more conservative. Use that efficiency to just get an idea of what size battery you're even talking about. And then the rated power capacity is a different factor you have to meet, and that's just kW, kilowatts. No H in there, no hour. And that's just your PV system size times the C factor. Okay, all that sounds fairly straightforward, and there are exceptions. So for example, if the installed PV system size is less than 15% of that size determined by the equation we were looking at for the PVs, if that installed system ends up being a lot less than what that equation should be because of the SARA rules, for example, or your exemptions less because of SARA, then if that turns out to be less than 15%, you don't have to have the battery exception. Or if the battery size in that kilowatt hour rated capacity is less than 10, you're not required to have a battery. And then in climate zone 1, there was no battery storage system required for offices, schools, and warehouses. But under the 2025 code, that exemption got removed. And so climate zone 1 is no longer off the hook coming up in 2025. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the energy and power capacities of that battery storage system per the code shall be based on tenant spaces, and this is for mixed occupancy buildings, tenant spaces with more than 5,000 square feet of conditioned floor area. Okay, so and then the image, I'll show you what that looks like in a calculation. And then the image on the right just gives you an idea of, again, what some of those battery towers can look like. And if you don't need too many batteries, it could be a narrower tower, or if you need the larger system size, it could be, like I showed you before, like up to 6 feet wide, 3.5 feet deep, 7 feet tall, etc. Okay, so let's take our same example with that mixed use building. We had a restaurant, 2,000 square feet, retail, 3,500, office, 7,000 of conditioned floor area. So now with that exemption, unlike the PV requirement where you calculate it for each of them prescriptively, with the battery, we're only needing to calculate it for that separate tenant spaces of that 5,000 square feet or more. So basically, we're just going to do it for the office. So now we calculate our new PV kilowatt number, not because we're reducing our PV size, but because that's the number we're going to plug into our battery equation. And then we plug that number into the battery equation for climate zone B, with our B factor based on climate zone. And in this case, because I knew the size was going to be relatively small, I just pulled up the specs on a Powerwall. And so the round trip efficiency on that is 0.89. That gave us our kilowatt hour size. And then we do the power capacity in kilowatts. Take that same PV number, plug it in, multiply it times the C factor, and we end up with 9.2 kilowatts. Okay, so now we look at like the Powerwall. So the energy capacity on each one is 13.5 kilowatt hour. And then we've got an on-grid continuous power of 5 kilowatts. So basically based on the power capacity, 2 kilowatts, 5 times 2 would give us 10. That's greater than 9.2. Okay, we're good. But now when we take a look at the energy capacity, each of them is 13.5 kilowatt hours, but we have to triple that number in order to get more than our 39.14 kilowatt hours. So really, and these things are scalable up to 10 units. It's also important to note. So really, we could do this with 3 Powerwalls as opposed to a standalone tower. So some of it depends on the physical layout, how much space you have. Is it better to go with the 3 Powerwalls and all that kind of a setup, or one of the smallest towers if they make them this small. This is pretty small. So you can even get an idea there that your office of 7,000 square feet, kind of what you would need for this climate zone. And, you know, if you're dealing with much larger buildings, which is completely understandable for office buildings, you know, you'd have over 10,000, 20,000, over 20,000, then you're going to be getting into those stand-up towers. Now, under the new prescriptive measure for 2025, the equation changed. So just know that if you're permitting under 2025 energy code, there are some new formulas, and the new formula now they're calling that rated single charge discharge cycle efficiency. They're giving it the letter C instead of D, but it's that same number as the other equation. And now there's a new climate zone factor B in a new table. But when you come to your rated power capacity, they've eliminated that climate zone factor, and you just take the answer you got from the kilowatt hour number for battery, and you just divide it by 4. So as long as it has a rated capacity that's 4 times more, you know, as long as that rated capacity, is 4 times less than your energy capacity, you're good. You don't have to do a separate climate zone calculation. So it's some ways it's a little easier. Now, if you're dealing with Sarah, then the formula is a little more entailed because you're going to have to calculate your Sarah kilowatt PV number and plug it into the equation. But it's fairly straightforward. Well, that's easy for me to say. Hey, you code coach, you need help. If math isn't your thing, you feel free to call us. And then for the 2025 code, there is a new table for it. And with all the new climate zone factors, again, based on your occupancy type on the left and each of the individual climate zones now spelled out across the right. Okay, so back to 2022 energy code. When it comes time to getting your Title 24 completed for this, and to show that you're meeting the requirements for your PV and battery if you're taking it, there's the ACE Forms tool interview to do this, and you could do it yourself, or this might be the form that is produced by your electrical engineer or your Title 24 consultant, but this is the form, the NRCC-SAB-E for solar and battery. And then for the performance-based modeling, so all those things were the prescriptive requirements. When I said requirement, I mean prescriptively. If you're going through it as a checklist, then if you're going to take that pathway, then you shall follow those formulas, and that's the sizes you need. And that gives you a real good handle on what your project will be compared to, and it gives you a good starting point for, you know, from a design perspective. And then for the final permitting or for your whole project, you might actually end up doing your whole commercial building as a performance method project. And at that point, then whoever is doing the energy modeling will input all of the information about those batteries into the model. And so what they're going to need is that battery charge and discharge efficiency, for example. They're going to need the capacity of the battery that's proposed in that kilowatt hour metric. And then there's going to be some control options that you can take a look at. Most of our projects, I have had a project that had the advanced demand response controls. But usually we're not seeing that. It's usually just a basic, it's usually just a time of use control that the battery uses. And then there are some battery exceptions that apply to the non-res occupancy and multifamily high res greater than 3, where it had to do with the SARA or, less than 3% of the conditioned floor area available on the roof, for example. And then with that information, we can plug that in, and sometimes the battery size and the PV size will end up being a little different than the prescriptive formula. And then performance method, you'd go by the answer on the performance method. And that kind of wraps up the requirements for the non-res side of our battery requirements for Title 24. And gives you a little bit idea about the size and kind of how you could get an estimate of what you need to design for as an architect or someone on that. Okay, that kind of wraps up. So we have time. Well, I'm going to plug Code Coach again. And we're going to talk about upcoming courses, but then my thinking was we would have, a little bit of time for questions and then make sure everyone got out on time on the course. So if you do have Code Coach questions on any of the material we covered or anything else that has to do with Title 24 Part 6 or Part 11, Cal Green, you can reach out to us. And we're happy to answer your questions. So I'm going to turn it back over so you can hear about the upcoming courses. And then we're available for just dialogue or questions afterwards.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for joining us today. That was a great training. Before we move on to our question portion, just a reminder that we do have AIA LUs and ICC CEUs available for today. If you have any questions about receiving these, please contact me. My email is here. I also put it in the chat. In about a week or so, you're going to be receiving the recording from this event as well as the slides and a follow-up survey. If you have a couple of minutes to complete the survey, we really appreciate if you can do so. It's super important for us to get feedback, and we will use all of the feedback and responses to the survey to help develop new programs and decide what sort of trainings we're going to be offering in the future. So if you like this training and want to see more like this, definitely let us know. And this survey will only take a couple of minutes of your time. It's not very long. And I look forward to seeing you all on future trainings. We have a couple of upcoming classes that may be of interest to you guys. I have them listed out here. And you can also see other classes that we have coming up on our website, which again is 3c-ren.org. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jennifer.
Okay, thanks. I saw one question flash. Good question. What's the outlook for battery rebates for residential? So right now, most of the rebates that I know about are in those tier 2 or tier 3 fire zones. California, and like those, you would find it through PG&E. Also, if you're low income or hard to reach, there's potential rebates there. And then if you're asking more specifically on like tax credits related to the Inflation Reduction Act, still available. And then then we're in a, we're in a political situation with the court cases, making sure that the rest of the Department of Energy, EPA, and funding that was already allocated to various states and programs isn't clawed back. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's where you're going with your question, but we don't know either. Grant, you probably have something to say. No, he's shaking his head. No.
No, I
So,
know. I know there were a lot of really good battery rebates. Probably 8 months, 12 months ago. We saw a lot of single family projects getting their battery systems. Some people were saying they were all of paid for. I don't know how many of those are still available. It's kind of an ever changing market.
yeah, yeah, I don't know if I think the real thing to kind of keep an eye on right now is if you're in those high fire zone areas, because they're the utility companies in California in general are really trying to encourage batteries in those areas because they want them to be more resilient, self-reliant, be able to more easily shut down the grid. And they shut it down during high winds because, like what happened, down in the LA area, high winds is and dry air, Santa Ana winds. That's a bad combination. I just recently got to listen to a great presentation by our local fire department up in Tascadero. And they are just talking about everything they've been doing to minimize the risk in that community for fire. And there are folks that are just looking very closely at adding battery and PV to their system so they can function more independently. So as more and more people are using it, the prices have come down a lot more. So even since I did this course last year, the price of batteries has come down significantly. And, as that last report, it's down to $1,000 per kilowatt hour, which is, pays for itself for most people.
We had another question about if the PV panels have specific design requirements, orientation, and angle. So there's it's called the California Flex Install. And so if you use that, it kind of gives you what they've done is they've applied what you're asking for, orientation, tilt, parameters, and then it just gives you a credit for doing that flex install as long as you're within those ranges. I believe those are they're always wanting south, but I believe it's not 9270, is it, Jennifer? But it's pretty close. It gives you majority of the orientation not north facing. And I believe that tilt starts at 22 with a range as well. In the software or prescriptively, you specify those in the design, and it'll actually, give you the credit or derate your system based on what those inputs are. That's the closest thing to a design requirement. What they really want you to do is just model what it actually is and then tell you how much you get.
Right. And then for the PV system, it's if it's on a steep sloped roof, it's not really going to work too well to be facing it north. So that's where these sort of parameters that Grant come into play. But if it's a flat roof and it is just sloped like 5 degrees to the north, it's still basically flat. You'll get plenty of solar gains. And then even like Grant said, you do that performance method and we can input what's actually designed. So you can have a roof that isn't facing due south. You can have a roof of any orientation, for example. It just will estimate the PV production output of those panels that are not optimal.
Yeah. So then
But
you might need to add a couple more if it's a suboptimal orientation until.
yeah,
We're getting a couple more questions, Jennifer. Julie asked if we expect residential battery size. So Julie, correct me, I'm assuming you're meaning capacity, not like footprint. Maybe I'm wrong. To come down over time. Dimensions, I had it backwards. The actual size of the batteries. That goes back to chemistry, that kind of stuff. I wouldn't expect to see the footprint of batteries to be getting smaller anytime in the near future. Maybe one
in
day.
fact, they might get larger in some cases. And that's just because as we like, let's say you want to go with a battery chemistry that is more benign. It so far what we know about battery chemistries and what's out there, the more benign battery chemistries are less energy dense. So you need a bigger footprint for the same amount of energy.
And those are coming from costs of materials, fire concerns, as everyone's afraid of the fire concerns associated with batteries. It's pushing the industry into these safer cell chemistries, which then become bigger in that case. That's some of the driving factors. Um, Robert asks, he's heard about car truck batteries providing backup energy during blackouts. Is this a myth? No, it's not a myth. I had a friend who did the pilot program for PG&E, so a lot of their outage trucks are they have batteries on the outage truck so they can provide power to the home or the small sector of homes while they're working on repairing it. Um, there's also, I'm sure you've seen, there's, I believe it was Honda. There's different car companies that are trying to come up with systems where instead of purchasing a home battery, your home can use your car battery as a system when it's at home parked. So these things are out there. They do exist. The application and usefulness kind of ranges depending on, like I was saying, one is for a utility provider in emergency, the other one being an alternative system for a home design. Um, I wouldn't say any of them at this time are public market common systems. Um, yeah. Thoughts, Jennifer?
Yeah, it definitely exists. GM, Ford, think they were working on their like controllers, because you need the brains that and the truck they both have to be coordinated to do that. But in kind of like today's presentation, we didn't really hit on some of those because we're talking, building specific and how do you comply with California Title 24 as part of our Title 24 training, that this falls under. And to have your battery drive away and not be available to the house during grid outage doesn't help with the overall grid stabilization for California. But that technology exists and it's really interesting. And so they're also looking at like whole fleets of buses, for example, looking at doing that for school buses, because really you're only driving those buses when kids need to get to school and they have a lot of idle time. So the thought was as those fleets get electrified, then there's another resource for emergency or power outages that can be available that can feed back to buildings. Yeah. Any last questions? We're almost just right at time. And I want to make sure everyone can get to where they need to go. Oh, and so I want to say thank you. And I'm glad you could attend. And okay, I'm going to hand it back over to our host.
Thanks, everyone. Reminder to reach out if you have any questions for us. And thanks again to Jennifer and Grant for hosting this training. We hope to see you at another one soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.